Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be talking to this August Assembly. Raj, thanks for that very kind introduction. And of course, Magda, thanks for all the work you did in bringing me here. It's unfortunate Ravi is not here today, but again, let me express my thanks to him. What I want to talk about is much about what worked in the West for much of the post-war period seems to be breaking down. But this book is many things, perhaps too many things, some people say. But in some ways, it's my view of why capitalism sort of worked and putting the pieces together over time, over history, to show how the pieces sort of fit together. Of course, you can't do a comprehensive history. You have to pick and choose the dates you look at, the countries. So it seems a little sort of selective. But what I wanted to show with historical examples is how sort of the interesting balance that is capitalism came together. It's not just about free and competitive markets. They didn't emerge out of a vacuum. They emerged once the state could ensure safety and security for property, but also when the private sector could actually balance the state and put some constraints on state power. Both were necessary because otherwise unbridled state power means there was no sort of, there was no force on the other side preventing the state from acting arbitrarily. So that was one set of developments, and often when we look at the history of the 20th century, much of it was sort of caught up in this debate of how much government, how much private sector, right? If you think about it, the big battle of ideologies, communism versus Nazism versus capitalism, democratic capitalism, was often about the relative role of the state and of markets. But I would argue that that battle tended to ignore the role of the third pillar, which is the community. And of course, as everybody knows in economic models, it's all about simplification. So the community stands for a number of things. On the one hand, it stands for social relationships. Social relationships that allow us to augment what is provided by contractual relationships, that is the market, as well as citizenship relationships or political relationships, that is the government. The community augments that in ways that I will describe, and therefore makes the entire structure work quite effectively. But the community also stands in for that basic unit of political organization, people in a local group, which then combine together to ensure that capitalism, broadly speaking, works for everyone. The tendency in capitalism is for it to get narrower and narrower as the big players capture the fruits of capitalism. This is something that Adam Smith was worried about when he talked about the constant focus of business on creating protection for their business as opposed to competing. But what stops that from happening, to my mind, in the modern day is the role of the community working through democracy to keep capitalism fair. And if it does that, in turn, the people have an incentive to support capitalism, not to vote the oligarchs out. And in that sense, there's a balance that is established. And I will argue, I argue in the first few chapters of the book, that effectively this created the post-war balance. Post-World War II, we had a period of very strong growth in the liberal market democracies, but we also had a flourishing of democracy, which was unanticipated when you were in the midst of the Great Depression and you saw the rise of fascist as well as communist forces across the industrial world. So the fact that you would have a flourishing of democracy was at that point not known. And worked very, very well. We had 30 years of very strong growth, followed by about 20 years of moderate growth, not as strong. But till about 2000, it seemed like things were sort of working. There were trends underway which were problematic. But since 2000, we've had a series of crises wrenching the industrial world, but also increasing political anger at the current system. And I want to talk about what's perturbing the system to create that imbalance, to create the political revulsion to a system that works so well. And then finally, I will come to potential solutions. So let me get definitions out of the way. They're important, but in a sense, they're pretty stranded. The state is, I think of it as sort of the central government, broadly defined, contains both the executive, the judiciary, as well as the legislature. And what it does is it provides security and justice. That has always been the primary role of the state. But as the state has been able to not only do this, but also convey to the broader public that it itself would be constrained in what it does. It won't act arbitrarily, picking and choosing whom it favors, who are the enemies, who are its friends, and it doesn't seize their property. As the state limited itself sometime in the 17th and 18th century in many of the countries of Europe, it became possible for the markets to flourish without their own centers of power, such as guilds, which protected their participants. Markets became truly competitive, or had the possibility of becoming truly competitive. But as markets became more competitive, it also created the necessity for more state action. Earlier, things like social security were provided by the community. The community essentially looked after the people who were falling off. But as volatile markets hit the entire country and hit many communities at the same time, things like the safety net, things like unemployment insurance, things like old age pensions, things like healthcare started moving from the community to the state. So safety nets, what I call post-market support, became the realm of the state. But also the state recognized that in order to participate in capitalist markets, the requirements kept increasing. Initially, you didn't require any education. You could just participate. Over time, if you wanted to be a worker with a decent chance for living, a high school education was needed. So increasingly, the state became involved also in what I call pre-market support, providing schooling, for example. So the state sort of expanded, but it expanded with the market. And that's important to note. We often think of these as substitutes. The market, sort of more market, less state, more state, less markets. In fact, they tend to grow together. Run a regression of per capita income and the size of the state, and you will find that it's positively correlated. Wealthier countries, which typically have stronger markets, typically also have more state. Let's turn to the definition of markets. I think of the whole realm of markets, goods markets, labor markets, capital markets, but also importantly, firms. And these offer productivity as well as choice to people. And finally, the community. By the community, I have picked a particular definition. And one of the comments I get from readers of the book is, no, your definition of the community, which is really the proximate community, the village, the neighborhood, the mohalla, and if you think about it in India, I live in a cosmopolitan city like New York. I don't sense any attachment to my neighborhood, but I have attachment to my professional organizations, to my workplace, to the schools that my kids go to, and so on. That's fine. I just want you to have one definition to start with. You can superimpose whatever definition you want. You will see many of the issues sort of go through. But I want to think of it as your neighborhood, and I want to include local government and institutions like schools in it. So now we've got definitions out of the way. I want to talk about why the community is still important. The community has been weakened in many ways because the state and the market have not only emerged from it, but also taken away stuff. I talked about social security being taken away from the community, but markets, we used to trade within the community. We no longer trade within the community. We no longer rely on the community to provide a number of services that are provided professionally. In frontier US communities, when a child was born, everybody used to come and help out in childbirth, all the women who had children, because they had some experience, but there were no professionals. It was too small, too distant to have an actual doctor. Today, you would rarely rely on your neighbor to help you birth your child. You probably would actually go to a hospital. That's the sense in which markets have reduced the role of community, as has the state. Nevertheless, even in the developed world, the community still matters. It becomes a place where identity and values still are determined. You are from Boston, or you are from Brooklyn in Boston, or you are from a neighborhood of Brooklyn. And similarly, it fills in the holes left by the market and the state. One example is in Southern Europe, when they experienced the Great Recession. People didn't have enough unemployment insurance to last more than a year. As the recession dragged on and they couldn't get jobs, what did they do? They went back to the community, because the community didn't require a contract to provide them help, didn't require them to have rights in the community. It was implicit. It was an implicit bargain. I go back to my village, people will help me out, because that's the role of the community. So what I'm arguing here is that the community does fill in holes left by the market, and that is important. Also, the community, as I said, becomes a source of political organization. That's another role played by the community in today's world, because it aggregates up to influence the polity, even if individually we have little power. As an aggregate in a democracy, the powerless actually have power. And in that sense, that's also very helpful. One of the important points I want you to note is that democracy and capitalism tend to go together. It's very hard to think of any socialist country which is a true democracy, as it is hard to think of a capitalist country which is not a democracy. Finally, I want to allow for the possibility of other forms of community, and I'm not stressing only the proximate, but I do want to argue much of what people say as alternatives. For example, virtual communities. They don't necessarily contradict the importance of the local community. And there's a very nice example in the book given of a community a Toronto community. Developers started building an internet network as he built out the community. This was in the days of the intranet, so it was an intranet within the community. But he ran out of funds. So halfway through, half the community was wired, the other half wasn't. And the question that a sociologist who found this out had on his mind was, well, this is a perfect natural experiment. Let me see if the guys who are wired are closer together than the guys who are not wired. And what do you think the answer was? Well, it could go either way. Some people argue that the internet is taking us away from social relationships. We sort of sacrificing them. Therefore, we don't recognize our neighbors. Others would argue that it helps us keep in touch with our friends and relatives through social media. Well, it turns out the latter was true, that the people who were connected on the net were actually much more familiar with each other, because it was much easier to organize social gatherings simply by sending an email to everybody in the group saying, let's meet in the evening, day is wonderful, let's have a barbecue in John's house. Everybody met. Much easier to organize search parties for dogs and for children and whoever's missing. It was actually a community that came together as a result of the ability to use the virtual network. And that sort of makes sense, that it is possible for the two to add to each other rather than necessarily subtract. And my guess is the two are not necessarily opposed. And a sort of corollary of the story is the community got together so well that, in fact, they started complaining when the developer wanted to shut off the internet, which he was paying for, and get them to pay for it themselves. And so they came together to actually fight the developer and went up to City Hall to say if he didn't continue, he should be refused any new developments. So his message was, never will I wire another community, because they may actually rise up against me. So here is the picture I want you to take of why the liberal market democracy worked. 3 pillars: the state, the markets, the community. And the blue lines are what we've already talked about, which are traditional views. The state provides, enforces property rights, contracts, etc., regulates. Markets offer productivity, efficiency, plus also innovation and choice to the community. And of course, the state offers security, justice, improves people's capabilities, and offers them a safety net Those are the blue arrows. That we understand. Less clear are the green arrows, which are new. One of the arguments I make in the book is the private sector, an independent private sector, is really important to constrain the power of the state. And we're seeing this every day today. Why is it necessary it be independent? Because if it doesn't rely on the state for favors, it is much more capable of being independent. If you look across countries today, countries where the private sector is pliant, authoritarianism rises up much more quickly. With these populist nationalist leaders being elected, their ability to subdue others is much easier in countries that don't have independent private sectors. On the other hand, in a country which has a largely independent private sector, such as the United States, much harder for the government to cow the private sector. You still have firms like the Washington Post or the New York Times detailing all the misdeeds of the administration and keeping a check and balance. Not true in some of the emerging markets where similar authoritarian nationalist governments have emerged. There they've gotten away with much more. That's why an independent private sector is really important. And similarly, from the democratic oversight by the community is also very important in keeping capitalism honest. One of the big problems in capitalism is it tends towards concentration and collusion between the state and big private parties. This happened in the United States in the late 19th century, in the time of Ulysses S. Grant and going on. Large mega mergers between railroads created very concentrated railroads, and also we had very big East Coast banks. There was a sense that the poor farmer was being exploited both in terms of very high interest rates on the debt that he had undertaken, as well as very high freight costs for transporting goods. And so there was a pushback. And this was the first populist movement by farmers in the United States, basically protesting against the concentration of power in the private sector, which had gotten too close to the legislatures. The railroads used to bribe entire legislatures by the simple act of promising them free passes for the entire season. And that was enough to get them to vote in their favor. So there was this collusion emerging, and the populist movement was an attempt to break the collusion. One of the outcomes of the populist revolution was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which has been very important in preserving antitrust in the US. But also one could argue that indirectly, Glass-Steagall, which was enacted in the Depression, was an outcome of the strong forces against big banks. And this happens every so many years. We saw the movement against Standard Oil in the early 20th century. We saw the movement against AT&T. And more recently, we've seen the movement against big tech. This is popular. This is broad-based. This is an attempt to keep power controlled is important. Last arrow, which I think is important, is from the community markets. We often think markets, are moving towards a value system which is sort of stands on its own. So shareholder value maximization has become the mantra in markets, right, today, driven by Milton Friedman's views. But of course, markets evolve. In the 16th century, shareholder value maximization was grounds for putting you in prison for the sin of avarice in a number of countries. Similarly, you see some evolution even here, that there is some pushback against shareholder value maximization in the current political debates in this country. So I think these three pillars and the forces between them create a kind of equilibrium which keeps the capitalist system going. By the way, just to show you, there are no diagrams in the book. This is really a way of capturing the idea. So what causes the imbalance? Well, a couple of factors cause the imbalance. First, great calamity. The two Great Depressions, one in the 19th century between 1873 and 1893, that was called the Great Depression before the Great Depression of the 1930s. Both of them caused enormous change in society because capitalism changed to create much more of a safety net after each of these, and that was an important change. A second big factor is technological change. As Raj pointed out, big technological changes, again, disturb society. For example, you could argue that free high school education became the norm in the United States, essentially as technology changed to require that kind of education in many of the factories that emerged then. In today's technological revolution, that is the information and communications technology revolution, again, we see tremendous change. And let me talk about how this is affecting society. One of the ways it affects society is by allowing for global supply chains. Now, why does that matter? Well, today we can produce in Thailand, and because shipping costs are relatively low, and because we can monitor on a minute-by-minute basis what's happening in that factory in Thailand, we essentially can produce as well as we could if that factory was in Indiana. So what that does, the fact that we can monitor production across the world, is the old combination of activities in a country, because they were all linked together, has broken down. Earlier, for example, research and development and design used to be largely done in the industrial countries. So manufacturing was also done because marketing and finance also were done in the industrial country. That part, manufacturing, which could be separated, was sort of linked to the others and kept in the industrial country. Now that the links can be severed because we can do the R&D and design in the industrial country, get the product manufactured abroad, bring it back or sell it somewhere else, and do the marketing and finance still in the industrial country, means you can essentially separate the activities. Who wins? Well, the guys doing R&D and design win because they have a much larger market to service. The guys doing manufacturing don't. They lose because now their work has been outsourced. Example, Apple, since 2004, it hasn't produced a single thing in the United States. It outsources it because it controls through research and development and design the basic property rights. It gets a rent for that, and it pays Foxconn to manufacture its stuff in Taiwan or China. So in the Apple iPhone, $1,000, $300 goes to pay the guys in China for manufacturing it, $700 stays in the United States. So in a sense, what we have in that situation is manufacturing jobs being outsourced because they no longer have the protection of being linked to design and R&D, which have stayed, but manufacturing has been outsourced. What this has done is also within country created inequality. The cities are flourishing, Boston, San Francisco, New York, while the semi-rural areas which had big manufacturing establishments are hurting because as establishments have closed, there's nothing left. That's one. More generally, middle-income jobs have gotten hollowed out. The factory workers, the well-paid factory worker is being taken over by the well-paid factory worker in Mexico or Thailand. But even the tax accountant, the bigger sort of effect on job losses, middle-income job losses, comes from technology. The tax accountant who used to do your taxes around this time of the year has disappeared because you download TurboTax and pretty much can do your taxes yourself. Unless you're my daughter, in which case I do her taxes for her. But typically, what you've done is again outsourced it, but this time to technology. That creates a hollowing out of middle-income jobs that's been recognized in every developed country that people have looked at. But there's something more than that. Much of the hollowing out comes from technological change, not so much from trade. But trade has the greater local impact because the big firm leaves town, and therefore that was the only source of employment locally, and therefore trade is often seen as the bigger harm. But if you ask economists, 4 out of 5 jobs are lost because of technological change, and only 1 out of 5 comes because of trade. The other impact of technological change is it has created a worldwide market for certain kinds of professions. What you see on the left is Elizabeth Billington, who was the star of the London Opera in 1801. Elizabeth Billington earned between 10 and 15,000 pounds. She used to fill the opera house, but there was a time when there was no recording. So you really had to be in that opera house to listen to her. So when you say she filled the opera house, she probably interacted with 100,000 people during the entire season. Lady on the right, who's she? I mean, more recognizable than Elizabeth Billington, right? Anybody? Taylor Swift, right. Somebody knows their music. Taylor Swift earned 170 million. So 10 to 15,000 pounds is about $1 million in today's money. Taylor Swift made 170 million in 2016. How did she make 170 million? Even though, people pay far less to hear her songs than people pay to enter the London Opera House, but her songs were downloaded, one of her songs, which I just checked, was 5.5 billion times. 5.5 billion times listened to on YouTube. That's, many, many orders of magnitude more than the number of people who listen to Elizabeth Billington. So increasingly what we have is global markets for the very best. And because they have global markets, they basically can make significantly more. You would pay Taylor Swift a lot of money, but you tend to pay the local singer much less because you have the option of listening to Taylor Swift. So superstar industries have an even bigger skew than the normal industry in terms of where money-making opportunities lie. You really have to be the best in superstar industries to do well. So that's as far as markets go and how technological change has affected markets. Let me now come to how this affects the government. And I just want to point out to one thing, which is as markets become global, governments also become more globalized in the sense of more governance activity migrates upwards. Give you a simple example. When banks were situated largely in a community, the capital requirements were set by the community because it was a local entity. As they became statewide banks, the capital requirements were set by the state. As national banks started emerging, the capital requirements were set by the nation. And today with multinational banks, where are capital requirements largely set? In Basel, behind closed doors. The point is that governance also tends to migrate up to larger, to more global. In other words, the community gets disempowered as these governance powers move up. And finally, the ICT revolution has also disrupted the community. I've already said that it has uneven impact. The cities on the coast, the big flourishing cities like Boston and New York doing very well, the interior areas not doing well, right? But there's a more insidious problem than just the fact that you have different economic impact. What the ICT revolution has done is increase very much the returns to doing really well, to having really great education. Now, if a couple, 25, 30 years old, professional couple, was asked, how do we get the best schooling for our children? What's it going to say? Well, typically, today it's going to say, well, where are the best schools? The best schools are schools in which my child is surrounded by other very well-prepared children. The quality of your companions is one of the biggest factors in determining the quality of your education. But where am I going to find other well-prepared kids? Well, typically the kid absorbs a lot in the community it grows up in, largely from the family. If you have professional parents, you hear many more words in your childhood than if you have non-professional parents. You have better nutrition. Your mother plays Beethoven to you while you're still in the womb in an attempt to get you to appreciate music. A whole bunch of benefits they get by the age 5, which is when my colleague Jim Heckman says you're pretty much made for life. Jim Heckman, as you know, is the Nobel laureate economist who studied education and its impact, and he says pretty much a lot of the difference comes early on. Well, if that's the case, if you're trying to get the best deal for your children, today I think you can't do much worse than choose the most expensive community you can afford or the most expensive school you can afford if you can't move community. So if you're in an urban area where you have all kinds of people living, you choose a private school, which is expensive. If you are, you can choose community, you would choose a community which is rich, so that the public school is largely populated by well-to-do children of well-to-do parents. In other words, what we have is the secession of the successful. We go to live where the other successful live, and this has become even more important as the returns to education, certainly at the edge, have increased. What you find is, sociologists who look at this find that in the US, the middle-income communities, where many people of all kinds are there, has given way to extremes. People are moving into communities of the rich, as well as leaving behind communities of the relatively poor, which is what is going to happen if the rich leave the middle-income community and the average incomes in that community descend. So in other words, we are getting segregation. Or put differently, what the technological revolution has done is created a meritocracy. This is the nirvana that the middle class was always hoping for. But that meritocracy is now a hereditary meritocracy where only the children of the successful succeed. So in other words, you have to be upper middle class to succeed. This is notwithstanding all the recent news on rich parents buying sort of special privileges for their kids. Even forgetting that, the system is skewed right from the beginning against those who are poorer, and we've had the disintegration of the mixed community. There's no villain here. You can't blame parents for wanting the best for their kids. But in that process, the system changes to one that reduces the opportunity for those left behind and enhances the opportunity for those who make it, who are more rich. I mean, today this debate is playing out, for example, in New York, where an examination of the admission in the Stuyvesant public school reveals that there are very few African Americans and Hispanics who've gotten in, and this is a public school. Of course, the kids already in will say, well, we got in merit-based, etc. But you can see that, some of this is a little skewed right from the beginning. And this is how, to some extent, we get the disintegration. What this generates is widespread anger. We need to change. The people left behind complain. Now, rather than complain about the system, which they need to change, some of them want to find scapegoats, because it's not themselves that need to get better skills and so on. It's that corrupt elite which has elevated the immigrants, elevated the minorities at the expense of the majority community. That plays well in a number of countries. It plays well in India, where sometimes the Hindu majority is told that one of the reasons you are not doing as well is because there are these others who are taking your place. But it also works well in a number of industrial countries. It is those others who are substituting for you. This is what we call populist nationalism. Blame the elite, blame the others, and focus on a smaller group that you think are the legitimate citizens of the country who have been hit hard by the elite favoring the others. The citizens of nowhere fighting against the true citizens of the country. And the problem is this prepares us very poorly for a future of technological change, because blaming others will not prevent technology from actually changing the nature of the job. As I said, it's far more important than outsourcing, and will continue. You can't prevent technological change. And unless we skill up our populations, we're going to have deep problems in dealing with the changing nature of work. Moreover, one of the problems with population aging is that the big entitlements that we voted for ourselves way back are increasingly looking as if they're unattainable. Growth has slowed since when we voted those entitlements in the 60s and 70s. Today, there's a real question in aging populations in Europe: who is going to pay for the elderly down the line? Who's going to pay the taxes that will pay the pensions that have already been handed out? And the answer almost surely is not robots, but immigrants. We can increase labor force participation by women. The elderly can still stay later in the labor force. Japan has tried all this. But even a homogeneous society like Japan is now considering that taboo word, immigration, because it realizes that it needs immigrants in order to support the aging. So that's, blocking trade is not going to block technological progress. Blocking immigration is probably shooting oneself in the foot, because down the line, we will need those immigrants to provide the support for our entitlements. And of course, as we age, where are the markets going to be? They're going to be in the developing countries, in the Middle East, which is still very young, in Africa, which is still very young, in South Asia, which is still very young, including India. And the worst thing to do is break up the world today with high barriers, because that world will stay broken up when you need those other markets to send goods to. So in other words, raising barriers today to both the flow of goods and services as well as immigration is very short-sighted. That's why I say populist nationalism is the wrong answer. And finally, it's the wrong answer because we have global problems. Climate change, for example. How do we deal with climate change when you're erecting 25% tariffs on the guy that you want to work with? You're creating a hostile international environment when every country says, we want to make our country great again. In that environment, much harder to do global deals, and I think that's worth considering also. So what are my solutions? I think these problems are big, but I really have a lot of respect for the old system. So I want to go back to something that works better, but that looks like the old system in the sense of maintaining the balance. And that's one part which some of the readers of the book find a little dissatisfying. They want revolution. My whole point is you need balance, because doing away with markets, as some guys want to suggest, will simply create a very different structure. You can't do away with markets and preserve everything else. For one, I think you probably will have to dispense with democracy if you do that. Similarly, I think you can't just exclusively focus on the community. In this global environment, the community is too inefficient on its own. You have to look for a new balance, which means changes at the margin rather than radical changes. So I would argue one of the things we can do is pull power back from the international to the national, and from the national to the local. At the national level, pulling back sovereignty that's been given up, say to the Euro area, to the European Union, or say to international agreements, doesn't necessarily mean that you are hostile to international trade and international investment flows. It just means that you want the ability to take a different view on some of these issues, such as, for example, on what kinds of rules you accept from the international community. Capital requirements, for example. Why should I accept the international capital requirements? Maybe I need to set them domestically based on my needs. So what I would argue for is sovereignty, but it has to be responsible sovereignty, not I take sovereignty and then each one for himself. We have sort of competitive nationalism. Instead, it's sovereignty recognizing we all belong to the same world, and therefore we have to be responsible about exercising our sovereignty. We work together for the global good on areas where we need to work together. At the national level, because we have varied groups within the country, I would argue for a civic nationalism. In other words, I'm echoing the view that prevails in the United States or in India, which is that you are a citizen of the country so long as you fulfill some formalities, but also you adhere to the vision of what that country stands for that is embedded in documents like the Constitution. So you are a national not because of what the color of your skin or your religion looks like, but because you adhere to the broad values. So civic nationalism at the national level, but much of the desire for cultural continuity then gets expressed at the local level in your local community. If you want to extol your wonderful Polish history as being a Polish American, you get to do that within your community rather than subjecting the entire nation to a Polish American view. So that allows for local expression, local continuity, but also allows communities to work with each other in the broader scheme of things. So I argue for what I call inclusive localism, more local powers, more community strength, but not erecting barriers around the communities such that you prevent people from coming in, some kind of apartheid or segregation, or that you prevent goods from flowing across community borders, those barriers are kept low. So a community is well integrated into the country. So what is this community like? What does localism mean? Localism is also an answer to the problem of different economic needs. The economic needs in Pilsen, which is plagued by crime, is very different from the economic needs in, for example, in Boston, which has much less crime. There are a different set of needs that need to be addressed. So I call for localism, which means empower the locals so that they can address their needs. But this requires a number of factors which can be enhanced. For example, we do need community leadership to take up the challenge. How do we generate community leadership? Very hard to tell how leaders emerge. But create the conditions where communities can get good leadership by keeping them from losing people. So find ways to keep good people in the community. Sometimes, for example, forgive the college loans of people who stay in depressed communities because they're doing some service by, in fact, staying and organizing. You could think of solutions like that. Push more powers to the local community so that people feel engaged. Today, there's far less to feel engaged because too much is determined outside in the state capital or the national capital. If, for example, local curricula was determined within the community, we would feel more engaged and go in because I want to make sure that my kids learn this or your kids learn that. That would be a form of engagement. I even say it's worth going back to the old times when communities doled out social services because that gave them a sense of engagement. Now, I'm not saying that communities should determine your social security, but at the margin, for example, when we have unemployment insurance which runs out, perhaps communities can decide whether to top that up because now the state has done what it could, the federal government has done what it could. Now the community can take up the role of further topping up social security or unemployment insurance for those who are deeply unemployed. And that allows local information to come into that decision, but also allows local engagement. People now know that such family is in deep trouble, and they come around to help that family, not just with employment. I think this is possible today with the virtual. I talked about how the virtual adds to the real, but can also allow the community to engage much more. For example, community services, if they're falling behind, today there are apps. I identify a pothole, I see and click it. The GPS location of the pothole goes to my municipality website, gets displayed, and I can check when the community actually filled it. So I have a direct monitor on the community doing what is necessary. This doesn't mean, localism doesn't mean the government has no responsibility. The central government can provide infrastructure. For example, still a number of communities in the US don't have access to broadband. In the digital age, this really keeps them from participating in the economy. So that would be a responsibility of the national government to provide the infrastructure. Also, it could decentralize funding that is centralized today. That's another thing it could do. But broadly, what this means is with communities having varied levels of economic distress, the wrong thing to do today is a national policy to fix it. For example, continued monetary stimulus forever until we get that, because many of these communities cannot benefit from that stimulus. They can't really generate more growth with low interest rates because there's no willingness to put more assets in that community. The real answer is to fix the problems that plague investment and business in that community. For example, if it's crime, you need to fix crime. The Pilsen community in Chicago did precisely that. It was being held back by crime, murder rates, which were comparable to the worst days of World War II in the war in Germany. And what they did was they said, the first thing to make this community attractive to business is crime rates have to come down. They found that a few bars were where a lot of the criminals congregated. They asked the city to shut down those bars and petitioned the city, finally got them shut down. They also found that one of the reasons criminals sort of flourished is nobody was willing to report the crime, and nobody was willing to come out into the streets and confront the criminals. So they started saying, we should go out, we should report. And when multiple people reported, the criminals couldn't target one family to retaliate. That also brought down crime levels. So community engagement, focusing on a problem the community identified, brought down crime. Once crime was brought down, people wanted to invest in the community. So I would argue that's really much better than identifying particular opportunity zones and saying we should put more money there, because that doesn't figure out what the specific problem of that particular locale is. And one example of a centralized policy that didn't work was precisely getting investment into the Long Island City, Queens. Amazon came in with 25,000 jobs, and Queens basically said, we're not interested. You need to understand why that happened. And I think that's a reflection of not taking the community into account. And finally, people sort of wonder if what I'm talking about is communities that essentially erect high barriers, keep out others, keep out other goods. Absolutely not. I'm talking about the community of tomorrow, which is inclusive communities. For example, I would discourage neighborhood residential zoning, even though that keeps rich communities together. It keeps them together because they have a way to keep others out, but that's a form of segregation which I think is problematic. So I would be very much against that power while encouraging other powers. Now, when I say empower the community but don't let it become exclusionary, am I talking about a contradiction? And the answer is no, I'm not talking about a contradiction. This actually already exists in the United States in the form of what is known as the Commerce Clause. In the Commerce Clause, states have the right to decide a lot. So this is a form of decentralization. What they don't have is the right to keep out goods and services from other states. That's where Congress makes rules for the entire nation. In other words, you have decentralization over many sort of elements of production, but you have no ability to keep out, to exclude, to segregate, and that's what I mean by inclusive localism. So are these solutions revolutionary? No, but they're really about changing the nature of the community. Let me end, this is supposed to be also about India, and let me talk a little bit about India. I mean, India is really, we have communities affected by the markets. They have been for a long time. This has created serious regional disparities, very different rate of progress of the southern states versus the northern states, for example. And in India, local government has very modest powers. We had Panchayati Raj, which is give more power to the village communities starting in the early 1990s, but really funding is still very far from significant, and we need more decentralization. Today in India, we have a populist movement, a populist nationalist movement, and it has some of the traits that we see in populist nationalist movements here today. We blame the Leutians elite, we blame their institutions for the problems that are created. We talk about the power of the people and how the institutions should succumb to the elected power of the people. And of course, we blame others, the minority religions in India, as well as sometimes immigrants from our neighboring states. So in that sense, this has some of the features. But also, because the central government has a lot of arbitrary power, this can go a longer way than in countries like the United States, where it is limited. The central government has the power to deny, for example, advertisements to the press, has the power to reduce tariffs or increase tariffs at will, and there's less transparency about how this process is done. So the central government is very powerful, the private sector is less independent, and so that's one area where India needs movement. It has a strong democracy still, so I think that's where it scores, but where it needs more reinforcement is in the independence of the private sector, which typically means the government has to pull back from doing too much, from trying to do too much, but doing much of it poorly because it simply doesn't have the capability to do all that it takes up. So that would be useful for India. More institutional checks and balances would be useful. I think India is very well positioned to grow from middle income to rich country because it has some of the institutions that some of the other countries that grew fast lack. It has a flourishing democracy, it has flourishing civil society institutions. Where it has some weakness is really the dependence of the private sector and the overweening role of the government, and that needs to be fixed over time. However, what it needs to do today is really reach middle income, and without government capacity, that is going to be harder. So it's a slower path to middle income, and that, once it reaches there, it'll do well. So to my mind, when people say, is India held back by democracy? A little bit. Democracy requires some constraints, but it also, it's hard to imagine India without democracy. It's hard to imagine any other system working well. And it is true that when we reach the next phase of growth, when we reach the frontiers, our current system will work very well. So with that, let me thank you and open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajan, for this thought-provoking, rich, and future-looking lecture. My name is Dr. Ruth Aguilera. I am a distinguished professor at Damore Makim School of Business, and I'm going to take questions from the audience. So one at a time. So when you ask your question, if you could please say your name and your institutions, if you're an alum, or so we'll start with you. Somebody will give you a micro.
Hello, Dr. Rajan. Thank you very much for giving this talk. So my name is Prakash, and I work for Santander Bank. So my question is, I think I'm just trying to understand more on what you explain, and you talk about pushing for the localism and everything. But in today's world where we are heavily in technology dependent, like for example, if I have to give an example, like if I am a Bitcoin enthusiast, it's very likely that I go and look for people who are in the same interest. If I am a PUBG enthusiast, I like to look at people in the other countries who are playing that. So basically the forces of the nature is against this community localism, right? We tend to talk to people of our interest and everything. And also with so much of the globalization, people keep moving around. So how do you propose this, like localism? How can that we achieve this when the very forces are against this?
Well, I get the question. It's a good one. I think that many people still live in more traditional communities. For everybody in this room, probably there's a different view of what the community is. But I think the majority of people in a country still live in the older traditional communities where they probably don't move that far from where they were born and live with people, think of farming communities, for example, rural communities. But it is true in the cosmopolitan cities, there are other forms of engagement. I would still say that you probably can't go and borrow from somebody that you're a Bitcoin enthusiast with. You can't get them to look after your child if you need to go out somewhere. The level of engagement in many of these is very light. It's not deep. And it's basically professional, and you would hesitate to ask for any favor from them. It's very, very professional and arm's length. And that's why I would argue that many people, as they grow older, find the need to go back to the personal relationships. And also, as our cities become more anonymous, there will be an attempt to recreate some of those personal relationships. For example, by getting to know the parents of your kids' classmates, because that's a way of engaging with real people and on a more personal front rather than on a professional front. So I think what we will see is a movement back to strengthening the proximate community. It may not be proximate in the sense they live next door to you, but it may be that they all live in the same city and share same interests so that they can get together. Ultimately, it's flesh and blood meetings that I think will become still continue to be important.
All right, let's take a question from you.
Good evening, sir. My name is Aditya Jalan, and I'm a sophomore at Northeastern right now. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming to Northeastern and giving this amazing talk today. I was very intrigued by the idea that you mentioned in your presentation about civic nationalism, and I was curious to know if you were suggesting maybe some kind of establishment of maybe a system of enclaves, like much like we have in American cities. Even in Boston, we have enclaves like Chinatown and the north side, the Irish neighborhood. Do you suggest setting up something like that in countries like India? And if yes, how do you envision maybe proposing ideas to propel interdependence between these enclaves as well? Thank you.
I am not advocating these enclaves as a necessity or even something that is right. I would far more prefer to live in an inclusive community with people of all kinds so that I learn from different experiences and different people I interact with. What I am saying, however, is that once you empower communities more, there may be more of a drift towards forming people like me. I recognize that possibility. I would say that there are two forces that prevent that from becoming the segregated apartheid-like communities. One is the requirement that they not actually discriminate against people wanting to come in. That's the application of the national law in a civic nationalist country. And the second is markets. Markets flow across, and so to that extent, it's very hard to keep goods and services from elsewhere coming in, and so there's only so much you can distort the production in your own community away from what makes sense. You have some freedom, but you don't have entire freedom. That's what I mean by an integrated community or inclusive localism. You have more power. So you may decide that you value being with other people like yourself so much that you move into a community like that and pay the extra amount of rent and so on it requires to stay there. But at the same time, there'll be others who want to live in mixed communities. All I'm saying is it seems to me at this stage, when there are these preferences, it's far less dangerous to allow people to succumb to these preferences than to force it at the national level. And what we have today is people of a certain persuasion coming together at the national level and saying, you know, this is our country. And that to me is much more dangerous because at the national level you have the army, you have various instruments at your command, and you're also reducing the freedom of others by saying you will all be, thus and such.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question which is coming from our Northeastern virtual community through Facebook, and Liz Marina is going to read it.
This may be similar to the question you just answered, but in today's world of echo chambers, how do we ensure that community engagement and discourse between communities happens concurrently, especially in the case of anthropogenic shocks, which can cause imbalances such as financial, epidemics, conflict, etc.?
Again, it's a good question, and this is where the proximate becomes important, right? That in the proximate community, where one community ends, another community starts. And so in that sense, it's very hard to prevent the discourse between communities. It happens, I mean, in the Pilsen neighborhood, one side of the road is African American, the other side is Hispanic American. But no, they meet. And as sort of relationships form across the road, hopefully over time, it becomes less segregated. And people start talking to each other, understand one another, see there are common problems, and start, mixing across borders. I think there is a possibility of segregating yourself totally more today with virtual communities where you can sit in that echo chamber and never actually move across. I do cite in the book some early evidence by some colleagues which suggests even that is not, it's not quite clear that takes place. The people who listen to the most extreme views on the left also check out the most extreme views on the right, perhaps to see how depraved the other guys are. But they still do check them out. And so I think we do worry about the segregated echo chamber, but my hope is the real community suffers less from it, and with the rules requiring inclusion, that in fact it still could work.
Thank you. We'll take a question from the very back. If you could say your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, my name is Ajinkya. Dr. Rajan, I have a very simple question for you. So when you say push power back from international to national and national to local level, are you advocating that any democracy works best when at a local level and that the people lose their freedoms as the democracy goes further away? So rather than having top-heavy governments in some far-away capital, would it not be better to have smaller governments at a national level and by extension more freedoms?
I mean, look, I mean, that's broadly the thrust, but there are places where you need national action. Defense, for example. So I wouldn't want every community to have its own defense force. That's the breakdown that you see in Mad Max. That's not what we want to go towards. But there are places where uniformity is not essential to mandate, where you can allow some variation across communities, and that gives them more power. And it's not entirely harmful, because so long as they're open to markets and to people, they will pick something which is more satisfies their needs, but which is not completely distortionary. So, I mean, for example, if communities had the right to decide whether they would admit big box retailers or small local retailers, they could figure out which makes more sense. And it would not completely shatter the nature of that community. But there would be more engagement, because now we can vote, now we have some real effect. I have a greater sense of control. And when I have a greater sense of control, I have less need to blame the outside. So, in other words, push back power to the extent possible, but not every power.
Thank you. Okay. You seem very... Yes, red shirt. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. I just want to derive from the example of inclusive localism. What kind of impact will this concept have on the GDP of developing countries, where we have a small group of independent industry and a very larger authoritarian government? What kind of impact this concept will have on the GDP of developing countries?
I don't know there's a direct link to GDP. What I do have in mind is there is sometimes, because powers have accumulated at the national level, there's a sense of fatalism at the local level. In Indian villages that I go to, they're always looking sometimes for certain activities, they're looking for the government to do it. Until the government shows up, they're not going to do it. And that creates, making a volleyball field. You could dig it up yourself, and you could put that volleyball field together. That's what a number of frontier communities in the US would do. But when you think the government is going to come and help you out, you may not dig. Why dig when they're going to pay somebody to dig it for them? And then you wait and wait, because the government never shows up. So that's the kind of situation where I think localism would be more beneficial. Today, in India, there's a significant water problem. And one of the things we've learned is that local water harvesting methods and local water management, reviving the old tanks, because in the olden days, they used to look at the natural flow of water and figure out where it was appropriate to make the tanks. Some of that knowledge is lost today, recreated by the experts. But if we divine where the old tanks were and built them again, we could have a far better water. We could replenish the aquifers, have far less water shortage. And some districts, some areas in Maharashtra have done it. But they've got together locally with NGOs and figured it out, and not waited for the government to come. That's the sense in which I think local empowerment could help tremendously solve some of the problems we have today.
Lady here. Yep.
Hello, sir. I'm Ria, and I'm also a sophomore in the business school here. My question is, and you talked about it in your presentation as well, we see a worrying trend towards nationalist governments now, not even industrial nations, also developing nations like India or Brazil. Do you think it's somehow a chain reaction? And what would be the long-term financial impacts of all of this?
So it's a very interesting question. Is it a chain reaction or is it common factors, right? So is it one impelling the other or is it common factors? I think there's a little bit of both. I do think that when you see other countries becoming protectionist, other countries blaming immigrants, it becomes less out of place, less gauche to do it yourself. It becomes more the norm. For somebody, to stand in an election on that basis, you don't look out of place. You don't look uncivilized, right? So that's the sort of spillover effect or the contagion effect. On the other hand, I also think the same common forces of technology are working across countries. And developing countries are slightly different, but it is true that middle-class jobs are much harder to find in India today than they used to be. And a lot of the angst is, what's the middle-class job for our kids? Some of the movements, for example, by the Jats, is really old landowning families finding that that's no longer a source of prestige. And they're looking for jobs, and often the only jobs that are still sort of safe and paid decent amounts are government jobs. So they're looking for government reservations.
Lady here on the third row, please.
Thank you. Hello, Professor. I'm Neha, and I'm also a grad student at Northeastern. So my question to you is about reservations. It pretty organically did come into the conversation right now. So I do understand that building communities and getting everybody on the same page is important, but coming from India, reservation has always been a pressing issue. So what's your take on how reservations could be effectively used on building communities, and what about the current state of reservations back home?
Well, I talk a little bit in the book about reservations. In the US, it would be termed affirmative action. And the question is, what role is there for affirmative action? And in a fractured world where a large part of the population doesn't find that they have access to the basic sort of means by which they climb out of poverty, there is a role for affirmative action, especially if it plagues a particular community. Because remember, communities build networks for you. If there's somebody in your community who's in a good corporation, you have the possibility of an interview. When communities complain about affirmative action and say those guys are having it easy, they forget how easy they themselves have it because they have all the networks that those guys don't. So it's in that sense that I think the community concept does say it's probably useful to have affirmative action or reservations for a group that has been historically excluded so that they get some of the trappings, some of the connections that allow them to move out. But I've seen the consequences when I was at the Reserve Bank. We used to have a party every once in a while for the staff, especially the what are called in India the class 4 staff, that is the people who used to do the messenger services and stuff like that, the bottom level of the hierarchy. And these were people who had a very modest education, probably from the backward communities, which is why they could get these jobs. But when I say backward communities, I mean backward caste. There's an appellation, backward caste. Today they're called Dalits in India. But the kids of these guys were often computer engineers, managers, spoke English fluently, and actually wanted to show me that they knew English because they had come so far. And it was really gratifying to see how much development there was in a generation. And it was primarily possible because their parents had good jobs. And so that job essentially became a source of affirmative action for the kids and the kids' kids. Now, the question really is, how long should this continue? And my guess is it should not continue beyond when the traditional disabilities have been put behind. And for a community, it means when a number of its members are already in positions that are reasonable. And for a family, it means when the family is earning a middle-class income. And this is effectively what the Supreme Court in India has said, that reservation should not continue for the creamy layer, the layer which has already succeeded, and it should only be for those who haven't. That said, I think two caveats. One, the poor in the majority community also may have some handicaps. And, Hillbilly Elegy in this country talked about the handicaps of people in the majority community that didn't have access to networks. So that's something that needs to be thought about for affirmative action. And second, there are the historically and continuingly disadvantaged. People who, by their ethnicity, by their color, by where they come from, are still discriminated against, even if they make it on the economic scale. And for them, the Supreme Court has said when the social discrimination ends, that's when we will stop having affirmative action. In other words, it allows for an extra oomph to be given to them. This is, for example, the untouchables, what were called the untouchable community in the past, that they still may suffer social discrimination. Their children may not get married to people in higher castes. Until that ends, the Supreme Court says we're okay with affirmative action for that group. That case could be made in India. I think it could be made elsewhere also, that there may still be social discrimination that needs to be addressed by economic improvement.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm a data scientist at Dell, and my question is related to your international imbalance of market. When you were quoting example of iPhone, that 300 we are paying for China and 700 research. So don't you think it's creating a balance? Because sometimes we are creating jobs in developing country, and then we need money for research. If we are paying 700 for research, it's for touch screen or image recognition or Siri in our iPhone. Don't you think we need money for research? Because sometimes it's a sunk cost for some companies, but we need large amount of money for research.
Yeah, sorry, if I came across as saying this was unfair, I was just saying that it was problematic in one particular sense, which is I wasn't disputing the 700 going to intellectual property or the 300 going there. Both are good. But the fact that the 300 going there has enabled the separation of manufacturing in the US from the intellectual property in the US. And so the manufacturing no longer needs to be done in the US, it can be done there, which essentially comes at the expense of manufacturing workers here. They're the losers in this, while the gainers are both the manufacturing workers there as well as the service workers here who can sell a product more cheaply with all the value added that they provide.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's go. Sorry. Ladies first.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Haim, and I'm a graduate student at UMass Boston. My question to you today is, how do you ensure localism in a country as diverse as India, while also having a uniformity at central level for developing policies or developing a framework that is beneficial at a local level?
Yeah, look, I think there are some areas where you need a central policy. I would argue that with the development of computers, with the ability to program stuff, those areas are diminishing. That computers can take care of the transaction costs of addressing different areas differently. And we don't need to have that uniformity in policy on a number of dimensions. Now, I think it would be useful to take as given that for democratic engagement, we want to push policy making as far down as we can. But there is a European principle called subsidiarity, which is push the policy down to the lowest level which can ensure that we get an efficient policy. And I would say that's the principle we need to observe. So some areas, for example, for telecoms to be interoperable, you need a global standard, you need a national standard. So I wouldn't say let's have localism there, because you can't talk to each other anymore. But I would say that on some other areas, for example, do we have big box retailers locally or small shops? The local community can decide, because my having a big box retailer doesn't necessarily create a problem for a community elsewhere.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. We're going to take maybe 3 more questions. So one here in the back.
Thank you so much for coming us in the evening. Thank you so much. So my name is Siddhant Chopra. I'm a freshman here in Northeastern University. My question is, sir, as being a central banker, what is your opinion on cryptocurrencies?
I was waiting for that question. I think cryptocurrencies are a technology looking for a use. I think that use will be found, but it will exploit some of the additional features of that technology. Simply mimicking currency is probably not going to be the answer, because we already have fairly effective currency systems. But doing more than a currency may be where the answer lies. I think too much of a focus on evading, sort of on anonymity, evading the eyes of the authorities, etc., cannot be the answer either. That some forms of cryptocurrency were used largely for illegal transactions or for avoiding border controls. And I think that has limited use, because if it does become really big, the authorities have an incentive to crack down. So where I think the cryptocurrencies will have a use is where they do things differently from normal currencies. I think we have yet to discover there's cross-border trade with smart contracts, maybe the answer. There could be others, but I think it's still in the process of development. It's one of those areas where I think the usual hype has come before the actual killer app. We're still awaiting the killer app. It may already be in development. It may already be out there, but I think we have to wait and see.
Thank you. Let's do in the very back in the red shirt, sir.
Thank you, Professor, for being here this evening. So I've been following the news in India, and off late there has been a talk about doling out...
To interrupt, tell us your name and institution.
Oh, my name is Nalabja, and I'm a part-time MBA student at Damur Mikkim. So in India, there has been a talk that the bottom 20%, will be given out 72,000 rupees per year. I'm just trying to think, from your perspective, do you think that that's really possible? Because like 20% of India is almost the population of the US. So are we talking, the way you think about it, would it be more like creating new value or, channeling some sort of funds to them?
Look, I think the proposal right now has to be fleshed out. And that is something, if you're talking about the Congress Nyaya proposal, is something the Congress has said it would flesh out if it gets voted in. It proposes to have a committee look into how this can be done, proposes a bunch of pilot projects, which presumably if it's pilot, it's about checking out how to do it effectively, and then rolling out over a period. Now, any such kind of system has to be carefully designed, because there are incentives on all sides which could get distorted. At the same time, I think the idea of direct income transfers is in many ways empowering at the most local level possible, empowering at the individual level or the household level. And a poor household which has some money power can command services from either the government or the private sector that it couldn't command before. And that could be a game changer. That's the whole idea behind direct benefit transfers, which both the ruling NDA coalition as well as the UPA have agreed to over time. So my sense is this is a version of that. It has a lot of stuff to be fleshed out. But the idea is any such scheme could be a game changer if done right. And we have to think about how to do it right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. Maybe as the moderator here, I'd like to ask the last question. And so I would like to conclude with a question about India. And I hope it's not unfair, as somebody who is not from India, and having the elections of India coming up, if there was one thing, what do you think is the largest challenge in India? And if there was one thing that you say it would be very easy to change, because obviously the communities is something that is more long-term, but if there was one thing in India that you could tell the future government to change, what would that be?
Great question. Obviously you want a quick answer and no depends and if this and if that. Let me say two things. One is the coming election sometimes is portrayed as a choice between national security and economic development. Now, some people claim both. Some people say one side has the advantage in national security, but hasn't shown so much economic development, and the other side promises better development. I think this is really missing the point that India's national security comes from economic development. If it doesn't develop economically, it will have huge internal problems, as well as will be too weak internationally to be a significant player. So India really needs to worry about economic development as a route to everything, including national security. Taking heed from Deng Xiaoping's admonition, sort of essentially saying, keep quiet and focus on building economic strength, because that is going to be how you become a great nation. And I think that's true of India also. In terms of what holds us back today, I would say the one important place where we need more effective action is, this may seem strange, but construction. Many developing countries have grown on the back of significant construction. I mean, China obviously comes to mind, but many developing countries have built out the roads, highways, affordable housing, etc. And in the process of building it out, one, occupied a lot of people emerging from agriculture, two, created many new jobs around the new infrastructure that's built out. What stands in the way of our building more is land acquisition. We are a democracy, I said, and going to middle income with a democratic structure is harder because things like land acquisition are much harder. You cannot afford to antagonize the people, and every time you acquire land, it's easy for an entrepreneurial politician to create an opposing faction and say they're not acquiring it properly. So we really need to think about how we acquire land in a way that is speedy, but also seen as transparent and fair to the people whose land is being acquired. Various kinds of sharing mechanisms have been proposed. But I think if we can fix that problem, we can enhance construction significantly, and that will enhance economic growth significantly. Of course, a lot of other things need to be done, but this, to my mind, you asked for one, it would be improved land acquisition.
Thank you very much for your excellent lecture. Thank you for answering all the questions. Very thought-provoking talk. We'll keep an eye on India very closely from the Center of Emerging Markets. I wanted to thank you. Thank Magda again. Thank Liz Merino, who helped us with the technology, Norm in the back, who helped us with the video streaming, the staff here, all the security staff, all the staff, the hosting staff, the gourmet India in the back for the vegetarian Indian, and of course, the anonymous donor of the gift of the Center of Emerging Markets. Ravi, unfortunately, couldn't be here, Ravi Ramamurthy, but I think we need to clarify that he's alive and kicking. He had he was called by the president of Northeastern, so unfortunately he couldn't be here, but he's very healthy. in Shanghai. And so I wanted to, with the help of everybody, a nice big Indian applause for Dr. Rajan. Rajan, you wanna do it? Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.